Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we slip quietly into a world where the air itself seems to bite, where every breath feels like it might carve frost patterns inside your lungs, and where the simple act of closing your eyes becomes an act of courage. You're not in your warm bedroom now. No, imagine yourself stepping across a muddy, trampled field, boots squelching, and ducking into a tent stitched from coarse canvas that sags under the weight of mist and frost. It's thin, it's drafty, and it doesn't care whether you live or freeze. The cold seeps through seams, rattles the flap, and snakes under every layer of fabric you pile over yourself. You think it's going to be cozy. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this without a few tricks stolen from men who actually did. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments, because someone's probably curled up in a blanket in Singapore right now, while another poor soul in Canada is hearing this at 3 AM. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first truth hits you as soon as you cross the threshold. A tent in the Middle Ages was never a cosy cocoon, it was a canvas compromise. Think of a giant triangular sail stretched over wooden poles pegged into half-frozen earth. Rain, it drips through the seams. Wind, it slaps the canvas like an angry drum. Snow, it piles up and sometimes collapses the whole thing. You kneel on the ground, fingers already stiff, tugging at leather thongs that hold the tent together, muttering that this is less glamping and more barely surviving. The floor is your first enemy. It's not a floor at all, just cold earth. In spring it's damp and swampy. In winter it's frozen like iron. You kneel and your knees scream. You sit and your bones rattle. You lie down and suddenly you realise, without something between you and this ground, you'll be losing body heat faster than a melting snowball in hell. Soldiers learned this the hard way, improvising layers from whatever they had. Straw when they could scavenge it, reeds plucked near rivers, brushwood hacked from hedgerows. Sometimes they laid down their cloaks first, knowing the damp would seep upward and ruin them. You, sprawled out now, feel the chill clawing up your spine, as if the earth itself is trying to drain you. The tent walls flap in the night, and you hear every sound outside, the muffled grunt of horses tethered close by, the creak of wagons settling, the curses of men outside arguing over rations, and the endless sigh of the wind. You pull the flap tighter, but it's useless. Canvas is no fortress. If you've ever had the misfortune of camping in a modern thin nylon tent in the wrong season, multiply that discomfort by about 100. That's medieval soldiering. And no, there was no zipper to seal things up neatly, just ties, flaps, and prayer. Here's one grounded fact for you. Knights and soldiers during campaigns often carried pavilions, tents that could be massive with painted stripes and heraldic banners, but the average foot soldier relied on much humbler kit. His tent was smaller, cheaper, sometimes shared with 2 or 3 comrades, sometimes none at all. These were issued by lords or cobbled together on the spot. The sheer variety of shelters across Europe in the 13th or 14th centuries shows how inconsistent military logistics could be. Some men had proper canvas, others just draped cloaks over poles. Think of it less as uniform army camping, and more like a chaotic patchwork of half-sufficient attempts. But here's where it gets a little strange. Some accounts mention soldiers deliberately leaving tent flaps open, letting in the cold air. Why? Because the alternative was worse. Smoke. Soldiers sometimes lit tiny fires in shallow pits dug inside their tents, hoping the flames would warm the air. What they often got was choking black fumes, smoke stinging their eyes, soot staining their lungs. More than one man staggered outside, gasping, coughing, swearing he'd rather freeze than suffocate. And yet, in desperation, many kept trying. Historians still squabble about just how common this practice was. Were fires inside tents the norm, or just a desperate trick in bitter winters? The evidence is scattered, contradictory and frustrating, which is, of course, the historian's daily bread. Imagine now lying back, cloak around your shoulders, helmet shoved under your head as a makeshift pillow. You think of your feather-filled cushion at home and laugh bitterly. This is nothing but metal and bone pressing into your skull. But fatigue is stronger than discomfort. You close your eyes, the tent breathes with the wind, canvas swelling like a lung, then slapping down again. A drop of condensation trickles down the pole and splashes cold onto your cheek. You curse quietly, shift, and wonder whether anyone in history has ever gotten a solid 8 hours under conditions like these. Spoiler, not really. Here's another vivid detail. Soldiers often went to sleep still wearing parts of their clothing or even armour. No one trusted the night. Enemies could raid, bandits could strike. Even your own comrades might swipe your boots if you were unlucky. So you pull your sword scabbard close, resting it by your hand. Your boots stay half-laced. Your mail hauberk? Maybe you kept it on, if you feared surprise attack. The cold made that choice both worse and better. Worse, because metal holds the night chill like an icebox. Better, because removing it left you even more exposed to the raw air. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And yes, here comes a curious tidbit, one recorded by more than one chronicler, that some soldiers rubbed themselves with animal fat or even goose grease before bedding down. Not exactly spa treatment. The idea was insulation, a greasy barrier against wind and frost. You picture yourself sitting cross-legged, smearing bacon fat on your calves like a medieval beauty regimen gone terribly wrong, then curling up to sleep. Romantic, number, practical. Perhaps, though one suspects it made you smell like dinner for wolves. You hear snores around you, men collapsed, exhausted from marching, hacking, bleeding, hauling. They don't even care that their breath fogs the air. Their teeth chatter, and their blankets are more holes than cloth. You envy them for a moment. How can they drift off in this misery? Then you realise the trick. Exhaustion. After a day of marching 20 miles under armour, carrying a spear, shield, pack, and sometimes even firewood on your back, you don't fall asleep. You collapse into it. Cold doesn't keep you awake if you've already been wrung out like a dish rag. But even collapse can be broken by dread. You dream of home, of a hearth's warm glow, then wake shivering to the shriek of wind and the creak of the tent poles. You remember that even kings weren't immune. King Henry V himself, during the Agincourt campaign, slept in tents on French fields under freezing skies. Yes, he had more comforts, thicker tents, rugs, braziers, but still, royalty lay under canvas and endured frost. It's almost a strange democratic fact. The cold did not care about your title. And speaking of royalty, here's a playful aside. Picture nobles trying to bring furniture into these tents. Folding chairs, collapsible bedsteads, even tapestries nailed up inside to block drafts. You, still lying on your cold earth, with straw scratching your cheek, might laugh bitterly at the absurdity. Furniture in a battlefield tent is like installing a chandelier in a porta-potty. Yet luxury found its way even into war camps, and soldiers at the bottom felt the contrast keenly. Still, not everything was miserable. There were moments, rare but real, when the tent became almost a haven. When the fire outside blazed strong and warmth filtered in, when comrades shared a joke, passing around a flask of ale, when the flap closed just enough to keep the wind down, and for a brief hour you felt almost human. That was survival, stitching together little patches of warmth in a frozen canvas world. Now, as you shift again on your makeshift bedroll, the ground biting through whatever layers you piled, remember this. Medieval tents were not about comfort. They were about survival, and barely that. Every soldier who crawled under canvas at night faced the same truth you feel pressing in now. The reality that cold, damp and darkness were as much enemies as steel blades. And if you thought you'd sleep soundly, well, welcome to the cold canvas reality. You're still here, tucked into your drafty tent, and the cold hasn't gone anywhere. If anything, it's crept deeper into your bones, finding every gap in your clothing. That's when you realise that your true armour isn't iron or steel. It's cloth. Scratchy, heavy, endlessly layered cloth. Wool and linen, wrapped and draped, pulled tight and tucked in until you feel less like a soldier and more like a laundry bundle that's rolled downhill. Welcome to the medieval art of layering, a strategy that stood between you and frostbite when the canvas walls refused to help. Picture yourself fumbling by the dim light of a smoky fire outside, trying to pull on an extra tunic. Linen first, because it's lighter, smoother against the skin, less itchy. But linen alone won't save you. It soaks up sweat like a sponge, and once damp, it chills instead of warms. So you tug a woolen overtunic across your shoulders, scratchy against your neck, heavy enough that it almost feels like a burden, and then another, and perhaps a cloak, thick, hooded, and fraying at the edges. You can hardly bend your elbows now, but at least you can still feel your fingers. Sort of. This was the everyday logic of soldiers on campaign. Clothes weren't chosen for fashion, they were selected for survival. Wool especially was the miracle fibre of the Middle Ages. It repelled water, retained heat even when damp, and could be woven into countless forms: hose, cloaks, tunics, blankets. Soldiers who came from wool-producing regions like Flanders or England often had an advantage: better material, better tailors. You'd wear whatever you could find, sometimes even scavenge from fallen comrades. A cloak was more valuable than a coin in the depths of winter. But of course, every solution came with a catch. Wool is heavy. Add layers of it, and suddenly your movement's slow, your pack bulges, your sweat soaks in. Imagine marching 20 miles in this wardrobe, then trying to peel it off when it's stiff with frost. No wonder chroniclers note how often soldiers stank, not just from lack of bathing, but because they practically lived inside the same layers for weeks. And yes, you catch yourself sniffing your sleeve now, wrinkling your nose at the sour mix of sweat, damp and smoke. Congratulations, you smell like an authentic medieval reenactor. Still, better itchy and smelly than frozen. One recorded detail from a 15th century campaign is that soldiers sometimes wore double or even triple pairs of hose, the medieval version of long underwear. They tied them awkwardly at the waist, creating a lumpy mess of cords and cloth. Not flattering, but again, not about style. And as you adjust your imaginary cords tonight, you can't help laughing softly. If any medieval tailor had tried to sell this setup at a runway show, the audience would have fled screaming. Here's a grounded historical fact for you. During the winter marches of Edward III's campaigns in France, English soldiers relied heavily on woolen mantles and cloaks issued in bulk by the Crown. Records in royal accounts show bolts of cloth being purchased specifically for outfitting the army. In other words, the king understood the truth you now feel in your shivering skin. Soldiers without layers were soldiers who wouldn't survive the night. Logistics meant not just bread and arrows, but bales of wool. And yet here comes the quirky bit that makes you grin despite yourself. Some medieval folk believed in layering so obsessively that they claimed too much clothing could actually trap evil vapours close to the body. You imagine a poor recruit swaddled in cloaks, grumbling not just from the itch, but from the fear that he might suffocate under his own tunics, or worse, get a demon-induced cough. Strange superstitions, but hey, when every draft felt like a ghost hand on your neck, you might start blaming spirits too. Now, scholars still scratch their heads over how effective this layering truly was in extreme conditions. Did 5 tunics and 2 cloaks really keep you warm at midnight in a snowstorm? Or was the soldier simply delaying the inevitable shivers, trading mobility for a slight reprieve? The debate isn't settled, and as you fumble with your imaginary hood now, you suspect the answer lies somewhere between better than nothing and still miserable. So you settle onto your straw-stuffed bedroll, wrapped in every rag and cloak you own. The fabric is stiff in places, greasy from earlier goose-fat experiments and full of little burrs that prickle your skin. You shift, trying to find a comfortable angle, but there's no escaping the itch of wool or the scratch of rough seams. It's not cosy, it's tolerable. And tolerable was good enough when frost painted the canvas walls white and the night felt endless. You close your eyes, you dream of silk sheets, feather beds, warm hearths, and the laughter of taverns. But when you wake, it's back to reality. Layer upon layer of wool and linen, the soldier's second skin. You mutter a curse at the itch, pull your cloak tighter, and remind yourself. Without these layers, you'd already be frozen stiff. And here's the funny thing. Centuries later, armies still relied on the same principle. Napoleonic soldiers wrapped themselves in greatcoats. World War I troops layered sweaters under trench coats. You're lying here in your medieval tent, but the logic stretches across ages. When the cold comes, humanity answers with cloth. Thick, heavy, imperfect, but life-saving cloth. Now the tent flaps again, a cold gust licking your cheek. You burrow deeper into your cocoon, muttering that it feels less like bedtime and more like laundry day gone wrong. But you survive, and that's what counts. The night may be long, but your layered wool and linen keep death at bay, at least until morning. You've already pulled on every layer of wool and linen you could scrounge. Your arms move like they're padded with sandbags, and your cloak scratches your chin. But even with all that, the moment you lie down, you feel the real killer. The ground itself. Cold, damp, unrelenting, the earth underneath your tent doesn't just lie there. It actively pulls warmth out of you like a greedy thief. Imagine stretching out on stone in a meat locker and expecting a good night's rest. Spoiler, you'd last about an hour before shivering yourself awake. That's why medieval soldiers improvised beds, not the feather-down variety, but straw-stuffed, fur-patched, anything to stop your bones from freezing contraptions that barely deserve the name bedrolls. Close your eyes and picture it. You've just staggered into camp after a 20-mile march. Your legs wobble, your shoulders ache, your boots squelch with swamp water. The commander barks for tents to be pitched, so you hammer in stakes with numb fingers, muttering words not fit for polite company. The tent is up, sort of, but the ground inside is still hard as iron. If you're unlucky, it's rutted and muddy. If you're lucky, it's merely frozen solid. Either way, you've got to turn this battlefield into a bedroom before the night swallows you. So you go scavenging. You grab whatever you can find: dried reeds near a river, bundles of grass, fallen leaves, pine boughs if you're blessed with forest nearby. You toss it in a heap, kick it around until it vaguely resembles a mattress, then drop your cloak on top. Congratulations, you've just built the medieval equivalent of an air mattress. Lumpy, itchy, and with a suspicious smell of mould. But when you finally lower yourself onto it, the relief is real. The straw lifts you just high enough that the icy ground doesn't kiss your spine directly. It's not comfort, it's insulation, and insulation meant survival. Here's a grounded fact. Chronicles from Crusader camps mention that straw was distributed as part of supply chains, not just for the horses but for the men as bedding. In some campaigns, it was doled out like rations. Soldiers might line their tents with it, then replace it every few days as it grew foul. And foul it did grow. Imagine lying night after night on damp straw, sweating into it, spilling ale on it, dropping crumbs that attracted mice. By the end of a week, your mattress was less of a cushion and more of a compost heap. Yet soldiers put up with it because the alternative was bone-numbing cold. And here's the quirky tidbit that makes you chuckle. Sometimes bedrolls weren't just straw. Men used old cloaks, torn banners, even padded gambesons as makeshift bedding. One account even suggests that captured enemy flags occasionally ended up as floor coverings. Imagine the petty joy of literally lying on your rival's colours as you drift asleep. Petty, yes, but morale counts when the wind howls. Now, historians still bicker about how common furs were in the average soldier's bedroll. Elite knights certainly had them. Wolf pelts, bear skins, even exotic imports like sable if they were especially wealthy. But did the common infantryman curl up under sheepskins every night? Some argue that furs were too valuable, kept for clothing or traded rather than slept on. Others suggest that in colder regions, peasants always had a sheepskin or two handy, and those would naturally end up in the camp. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, with wealthier or luckier soldiers cocooned in fur, and the rest cursing their straw piles. You shift on your imagined bedding now, the stalks poking your ribs. The smell of damp earth rises up. You think about how the ground never really let you forget it was there. Even with straw or furs, you could still feel the chill radiating upward like a ghost reaching through your blanket. And sometimes, that cold carried consequences. Men fell ill, their lungs filling with frost and coughs. Pneumonia wasn't called that, of course. It was just a deadly chill. But soldiers knew too many who never woke up after sleeping too long on frozen soil. There's a bitter comedy in how much effort went into this nightly battle with the earth. You'd haul supplies, fight enemies, march until your feet bled, and still the hardest fight came at night. You versus the ground. And the ground usually won, stealing your warmth hour by hour until dawn. Still, exhaustion has a way of beating discomfort. Imagine yourself at last collapsing onto that lumpy straw heap. Your eyes close before your head even settles. The snores around you rise like a chorus. One man's breath whistles, another groans in his sleep, a third kicks and mutters. And you? You fade into a half-dream where the earth no longer bites, because your body is too tired to care. Yet even in that dream, you remain aware of the risks. A spark from a brazier could catch the straw and ignite your bed in seconds. A sudden rainstorm could soak through the canvas and turn your mattress into a swamp. You live each night at the mercy of both fire and water, hoping for neither. In the morning you rise stiff, brushing bits of straw off your cloak. Your back aches as if you've been beaten. You roll your shoulders, curse softly, and promise yourself that someday you'll sleep in a real bed again. Then you lace your boots, grab your spear, and step out to march another 20 miles, knowing you'll be back on the same frozen earth by nightfall. It's a humbling cycle, really. The grand wars of kings and dukes were fought not just on battlefields, but on the damp soil under a sagging tent. Victory belonged not only to those with sharper swords, but to those who survived the nights without freezing stiff. And as you run your fingers through the straw one last time, you realise your bedroll wasn't luxury. It was your lifeline. So you shake it out, pile it high again, and prepare for another night. Because until spring, or until peace, or until the day you never wake, the earth will always be waiting to steal your warmth, and your only defence is a pile of straw, and the stubborn will to keep sleeping on it. You're lying there on your straw, wrapped in wool and linen, yet, no matter how tightly you curl up, the cold still nips at your toes. You realise there's only one force in the world that can push back the creeping chill. Fire. Not the kind in a grand castle hearth, with logs roaring and sparks dancing like fireflies. No. Out here in a battlefield camp, you're lucky if you can coax a flame out of damp twigs and whatever fuel your unit hasn't already burned through. But fire is more than warmth. It's survival. It dries your clothes, it cooks your food, and it keeps frostbite from gnawing away at you while you sleep. And so you find yourself crouched in the dark, digging a shallow pit inside your tent, gambling with your lungs in exchange for a few hours of heat. The pit is crude, just a hole scooped into the frozen earth with the butt of your dagger or the edge of a shield. Into it you pile whatever passes for fuel. Wood, if you're lucky. Charred sticks stolen from another fire, if not. Sometimes even dried animal dung. Yes, you wrinkle your nose, but when the choice is between stink and hypothermia, the stink wins every time. You strike flint against steel, sparks leap, and soon a thread of smoke winds its way upward. The fire is small, smouldering rather than blazing, but already your fingers sting less, and your breath fog seems to vanish into the rising smoke. Here's the historical reality. Medieval soldiers often relied on campfires in the open air, but evidence suggests they sometimes tried to bring the heat closer, even inside tents. The danger, of course, was suffocation. Canvas trapped the smoke, filled the air with choking fumes, and men woke up coughing, their eyes burning. There are records of soldiers stumbling out into the night to escape their own desperate fire pits, swearing they'd rather freeze, and yet, in bitter winters, many kept lighting those hidden flames anyway. The choice was grim. Freeze slowly, or risk snuffing out in smoke. Now, a quirky little tidbit to lighten the scene. Some accounts describe men propping open their tent flaps and using their own shields as chimneys. Yes, shields. They'd lean them just so, angling them to catch the draft and funnel smoke outward. Was it effective? Probably about as effective as holding a frying pan over your head in a rainstorm. But when the alternative was hacking up soot all night, a soldier would try anything. You can imagine yourself fiddling with your shield, muttering as the smoke insists on pouring back in, your eyes watering until you can't tell if you're crying or just smoked like a ham. And here's where historians keep arguing. Just how common were these interior fires? Some claim it was a desperate rarity, while others believe it happened frequently in colder campaigns, especially in Eastern Europe where winters were brutal. Archaeological digs of old encampments sometimes turn up scorched earth patches inside the footprints of tents, suggesting that, yes, many soldiers risked turning their sleeping space into a makeshift oven. But was it wise? The debate lingers, and as you sit here coughing in your smoky canvas hut, you can see why. But fire wasn't just practical, it was psychological. Imagine the difference between lying in the pitch-dark cold, your breath misting around you, and lying beside a faint flickering glow. Even if the warmth was minimal, the sight of flame was comfort, a reminder that you weren't entirely helpless against the elements. It also meant safety of another kind. Predators, wolves, stray dogs, or worse, desperate deserters, hesitated near firelight, and so you cradle your little pit as if it were treasure, adding fuel one splinter at a time, watching the embers pulse like a heartbeat. Still, fires brought problems that went beyond smoke. Wood was precious. In forested regions, entire landscapes were stripped bare by armies, leaving stumps where groves once stood. Soldiers sometimes marched for days without finding decent fuel, forced to burn broken wagons, discarded spears, even fence posts stolen from unlucky peasants. You can almost hear the grumbling. We fight for king and country, but tonight our firewood comes from somebody's pig pen gate. And when wood ran out, soldiers turned to dung, dried horse droppings, cow pats, whatever they could scrape together. And yes, it burned, but the smell clung to your cloak for days. You wrinkle your nose again just imagining it. Your comrade beside you snores on, oblivious, and you find yourself jealous of his iron stomach. Now picture the ritual of tending the fire. One man, the unlucky fire watch, had to keep it alive through the night. If it died, everyone froze. If it flared, the tent risked burning down. So he sat there, poking embers, eyes drooping, cursing his lot. You wake at one point to see him silhouetted against the glow, his face hollowed by shadows, and you wonder whether he's guarding you from the cold, or whether he secretly wants to throw the last stick in, crawl under his cloak and let the rest of you fend for yourselves. There's another angle too. Fire made you visible. Glow-through canvas could be spotted by enemy scouts in the dark. Some commanders forbade fires at night for fear of ambushes, ordering their men to endure the cold in silence. Imagine the morale hit. No warmth, no glow, just blackness and frost gnawing at every limb. You pull your cloak tighter at the thought, whispering a complaint into the smoky air. But when fires were allowed, the camp transformed. Step outside for a moment and see it. Hundreds of little flames dotting the field, smoke curling into the night sky, shadows of men huddled close, their laughter rising despite the cold. For a heartbeat, it almost looks like a village, a community bound by survival. And yet, you know that each fire is fragile, each tent a tinderbox waiting to go up in smoke. You crawl back into your smoky tent, coughing once, twice. The embers glow faintly now, and you wonder how much longer they'll last. You clutch your cloak closer, close your stinging eyes, and try to ignore the tickle in your throat. Because in this world, warmth always comes at a cost, whether it's your lungs, your supplies, or your sleep. And as dawn finally seeps through the canvas, you stagger outside with watering eyes and soot on your face, muttering that you survived another night. Barely. Fire kept you alive, but it never let you forget the danger you flirted with each time you dug a pit and lit a spark beneath the canvas roof. The earth beneath you was cold, the wool around you was scratchy, but fire was both salvation and enemy, friend and traitor. You hated it even as you clung to it, and as you brush ash from your hands, you know you'll do it all again tonight, because without it, you'd be nothing more than another stiff body on the frozen ground. The smoke still lingers in your cloak, your throat raw from the night's fire pit. The sun has barely risen, but already you know the cold will return with the dusk. And here's the truth. No matter how many layers you pile on, no matter how much straw you heap under you, or how carefully you guard a dwindling flame, the most reliable heater is the one snoring beside you. Warmth was not just clothing, not just fire, it was flesh. That's why medieval soldiers slept shoulder to shoulder, huddled like puppies in a litter, bodies pressed so close that the line between comradeship and necessity blurred into one long, shivering embrace. You shuffle back into the tent after a day's march, cheeks stinging from the wind. Already men are collapsing into place, dragging cloaks and bedrolls into piles. The space is tight, canvas walls barely wider than a wagon, poles in the centre stealing precious room. Yet somehow, a dozen bodies find a way to fit, each person adjusting, grumbling, nudging until you're wedged in like books on a shelf. Elbows jab ribs, knees tangle with boots, and before long you realise you've become part of a living furnace. It's not glamorous. You smell your neighbour's breath, sour with ale. His beard scratches your cheek as he rolls. Someone's feet, still caked with mud, end up dangerously close to your nose. But despite the discomfort, you feel the change almost instantly. The collective heat begins to build, layer upon layer, until the inside of the tent is warmer than the air outside. In the absence of wool stoves or central heating, this was the medieval answer: the human body as radiator. Here's a solid historical fact. Chronicles from winter campaigns frequently mention soldiers lying together for warmth. During the famous siege of Antioch in the First Crusade, men endured bitter cold by clustering in groups, sometimes even mixing ranks when survival trumped social standing. Whether knight or common footman, the cold stripped away hierarchy. Out here, warmth was wealth. and nobody turned down the offer of another body beside them. Now, for the quirky tidbit that always sparks a grin, some units deliberately assigned sleeping orders to maximise heat. The strongest or most senior men often claimed the middle spots, where warmth was greatest, leaving the unluckier recruits to the drafty edges. Imagine being the poor fellow stuck at the flap, half exposed to icy gusts while everyone else slumbered snugly in the human sandwich. You might try to wriggle closer during the night, only to be shoved back by a grumbling veteran who growled, "Stay in your place, lad." Survival, yes, but not always fair. Of course, scholars keep arguing about how this closeness really worked in practice. Did soldiers truly pack shoulder to shoulder every night, or did space and personal pride keep them somewhat apart? Some insist the accounts exaggerate, pointing to the stink, lice, and general human unpleasantness that would make such sleeping a nightmare. Others counter that in temperatures low enough to kill, even the proudest knight would gladly huddle up. The evidence is murky, and the debate continues, but as you lie here imagining the warmth radiating from a dozen bodies pressed around you, the logic feels undeniable. You notice the rhythm of the night shift now. Men roll onto their sides in unison, the tent creaking with the shuffle. One coughs, another snores, a third murmurs in his sleep. You adjust your cloak, tucking it tighter where your neighbour has stolen half by accident. It's not restful, not the gentle silence of a featherbed chamber. It's noisy, crowded, chaotic. But in the warmth of the pack, you doze anyway. And think of this. Armies weren't the only ones to discover this trick. Shepherds, travellers, even peasants at home often shared beds, sometimes the whole family in one pile. In a world without insulation, the human body was the surest heater. Soldiers simply extended that logic to the battlefield. The jokes practically wrote themselves. Men teased one another about cuddling their comrades, or waking up with someone else's arm draped across their chest. You imagine the laughter in the morning. "You kept me warmer than my wife last night." And yet beneath the banter was truth. In those nights, survival depended on camaraderie in its most literal physical form. The danger, of course, came when sickness spread. Packed so close, one man's cough quickly became everyone's. Fleas and lice hopped freely, chewing through ranks as efficiently as any enemy sword. You scratch at your neck just imagining it, wondering how many times soldiers woke itchy and cursing. But even that didn't stop the practice. Between freezing to death or risking a rash, the choice was simple: scratch later, live now. Outside, the wind moans across the camp, rattling canvas and snapping at flames. Inside, the air grows almost stuffy, condensation dripping from the poles. You stir, half dreaming, half listening, and realise that the warmth of your comrades is as vital as your sword or shield. Alone, you'd be stiff as a corpse by morning. Together, you stand a chance of waking up. So you shuffle closer, shoulder to shoulder, elbow to rib, sighing at the stink but grateful for the heat. In this world, brotherhood wasn't just about fighting side by side. It was about sleeping pressed together, bodies tangled, hearts beating, keeping one another alive in the endless winter of war. You've discovered the heat of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, the smoky gamble of a fire pit, and the scratchy embrace of wool. But there's one more trick medieval soldiers swore by when the night froze them from the inside out. Fill the belly, and the body will follow. Because no matter how flimsy your tent, no matter how lumpy your straw, if you drifted to sleep with warm food in your stomach, you had a fighting chance of waking up. And so, before bedding down, the camp always hummed with the rituals of supper: bread, ale, broth, maybe a scrap of meat if fortune smiled. This was no banquet. It was fuel, plain and simple, and it doubled as a furnace. Picture it. You slump onto a low stool or squat by a fire outside the tent. A battered pot balances on stones, steam curling from its rim. Into it go chunks of barley bread, some turnip, maybe a strip of salted pork hacked from a barrel. The broth thickens into something halfway between soup and paste. Someone ladles it into a wooden bowl, hands it over, and you clutch it greedily, warming your palms before your lips. The taste? Salty, greasy, vaguely earthy. Nothing to write songs about, but it spreads through your chest like a slow-burning coal. And then comes the ale. Not the fine, sparkling kind with fruity notes, but dark, heavy, often sour. Served lukewarm, sometimes with bits floating in it, but strong enough to put heat in your cheeks. Soldiers drank deeply, not just to dull the aches of marching, but to trick their bodies into believing they were warmer than they were. By the time you crawl into your tent, cheeks flushed and belly heavy, the cold feels just a little less sharp. Here's the historical anchor. Army records across Europe list massive purchases of bread and ale for campaigning soldiers. The English crown, for instance, spent fortunes supplying archers and men-at-arms with daily rations heavy on carbs and drink. Why? Because calories meant heat. A full belly burned all night, releasing energy that kept soldiers alive when temperatures dropped below freezing. The link between food and warmth was no mystery. Even the humblest peasant knew you didn't face a winter's night on an empty stomach. Now for the odd little tidbit. Some medieval soldiers swore by eating raw onions or garlic before sleep. Yes, raw. They believed it heated the blood and staved off chills. Imagine lying there, breath pungent enough to fumigate a small village, while your comrade rolls over and groans, "Next time, eat the onion outside." Still, superstition or not, the sharp bite of onion probably did warm the body briefly, even if it ruined tent-mate relations. But historians still wrangle over just how effective alcohol was in these conditions. Modern science tells us it dilates blood vessels, creating an illusion of warmth while actually hastening heat loss. Did soldiers know this? Almost certainly not. They drank because it felt good, because it knocked them into sleep faster, because the bitter cold seemed softer through a boozy haze. Scholars argue whether commanders encouraged it or tolerated it grudgingly, knowing it was both blessing and curse. Some armies even rationed wine and ale carefully, fearful that too much drunkenness would leave half the men snoring while the enemy raided. You set down your imaginary bowl now, your belly comfortably heavy. The tent may still groan with the wind, the straw may still poke your ribs, but you feel warmer than you did yesterday. The food has taken the edge off, spreading through your limbs in a quiet glow. Even the noises outside, the laughter, the quarrels, the clang of pots, fade into a lullaby when digestion kicks in. Think, too, of the symbolism. Bread and ale weren't just rations, they were life. Shared among comrades, they forged bonds. A man who split his crust or passed his jug became more than a tent mate. He became kin in misery. Around the fire, jokes rose, songs sputtered into life, and for an hour or two the cold didn't matter. Supper was not just a practical defence, it was a ritual, a nightly reminder that even in a muddy camp men could feel human. But the dangers weren't gone. Too much ale could mean staggering out to vomit in the snow, losing both food and dignity. Eating too fast could lead to cramps that made sleep miserable, and sometimes there simply wasn't enough. Empty stomachs meant nights of misery, with soldiers curling tighter, shivering harder, their bodies unable to burn what wasn't there. You sigh as you settle, cloak drawn close, belly filled in our imagined feast. Outside, the last of the fires crackle, guards tramp by with pikes in hand, and the camp begins to quiet. You roll onto your side, your neighbour grumbles, and the warmth from food, drink and shared body heat begins to blend. It's not luxury, it's not even comfort, but compared to hunger, it's heaven. And so, you drift off, lulled by the weight in your stomach, by the ale's haze, by the knowledge that tonight you've bought yourself a few more hours of warmth. Tomorrow, the march resumes. Tomorrow, the cold will strike again. But tonight, at least, bread and ale stood between you and the frost. You wake up groggy, your head heavy from ale, your cloak stiff with the smoke of last night's fire pit. The ground still aches in your bones despite the straw, and outside, frost rims the edges of the canvas. It takes a moment to remember you're not waking in a featherbed, but in the same drafty tent where the cold is waiting to bite again tonight. And so, before the sun even dips, you start thinking about how to outsmart it. Because all the cloaks, all the layers and all the ale in the world still leave gaps, the little exposed places where frost sneaks in. Toes, fingers, ears. Those extremities always betray you first. And medieval soldiers knew this truth as well as you do right now. If you don't protect the ends, the middle won't matter, so you turn your attention to your feet. They've carried you over miles of mud and snow, shoved into boots that have seen better days. The leather is cracked, the seams leak, and every step today has filled them with damp. Left untreated, they'll freeze before midnight. So you peel off the boots, wincing at the sight. Socks stiff with sweat and dirt, skin pale and wrinkled from cold moisture. You mutter a curse, then pull out your one secret weapon, woolen socks, thick, scratchy, woven by some village woman months ago, patched already at the heels. You tug them on, wriggling your toes, and instantly the world feels more survivable. Wool was the great gift to every medieval soldier's kit. Unlike linen or cotton, it could stay warm even when damp. A wet wool sock might not feel pleasant, but it was miles better than bare skin against leather. And in the coldest campaigns, soldiers wore 2 or 3 pairs at once, stuffing the layers into boots until their feet barely bent. This wasn't about comfort, it was about circulation, about making sure toes still twitched by morning. Now for the odder part. Wool alone wasn't always enough. Soldiers often smeared their feet, hands, or even faces with grease, bear fat, goose fat, tallow, whatever animal sauce they could scrounge. The idea was insulation, creating a barrier between skin and the bitter wind. Imagine yourself sitting cross-legged in the tent, dipping fingers into a pot of rendered fat, smearing it over your toes before pulling socks back on. It's not glamorous. You smell faintly like a roasting goose, but the moment you pull the socks snug, you realise you've locked in just a little extra warmth. This isn't just imagination. Historical anecdotes confirm it. Sailors rubbed animal fat on exposed skin to stave off cold winds at sea. Shepherds did the same on mountainsides. Soldiers weren't any different. Quirky as it sounds, this greasy ritual was a kind of medieval version of petroleum jelly. Primitive, messy, but effective enough. And yes, your comrades might laugh, muttering that you smell like the camp kitchen. But when their toes go numb at midnight and yours do not, the joke shifts in your favour. Still, historians keep sparring over how widespread this practice really was. Was it a common trick among ordinary infantry, or just a regional habit, more frequent where hunting produced the fat to spare? Some argue it was little more than folklore, a story inflated over time. Others point to scattered records of unguent being issued alongside supplies. The debate is ongoing, and as you wiggle your grease-covered toes now, you realise you've stepped straight into one of those unsolved mysteries. But it wasn't just the feet. Fingers too were wrapped in whatever scraps soldiers could find. Strips of cloth, torn from ruined tunics, spare bits of wool tied clumsily around knuckles. Mittens weren't exactly standard military issue, so men improvised. Sometimes they even used bits of fur from animals skinned on campaign. Gloves, when available, were treasured items stolen or traded if necessary. And always, underneath, another smear of grease kept frost from splitting the skin. Ears and noses weren't neglected either. Picture soldiers with their hoods pulled tight, scarves wound clumsily, bits of fur tied around the head until they looked more like scarecrows than warriors. And underneath it all, more grease. You chuckle softly now, imagining the whole camp smelling like a roasting spit, each man shimmering with animal fat under his cloak. Romantic? Hardly. But at dawn, when the enemy still slept and you still breathed, the joke was worth it. Of course, there were limits. Too much grease, and you clogged your skin. Too little, and the cold burned right through. And the socks? They never stayed dry long. Boots leaked, snow melted, streams had to be crossed. Soldiers often ended the day with feet sodden again, only to strip, dry by the fire, and start the greasy ritual anew. The cycle never ended. There's something almost absurd in how much effort went into protecting toes and fingers, the smallest parts of the body. But you know as well as any soldier that once the extremities fail, the rest follows. Blackened frostbite, lost digits, infections. These were as much enemies as arrows. And men who couldn't march on their feet or hold a sword in their hands quickly became burdens. So every smear of fat, every patched sock, every strip of cloth mattered. Now as you curl back under your cloak, the smell of grease clinging to your skin, you feel the warmth settle in. Your toes tingle less. Your fingers flex more easily. The wind outside still howls, but inside your cocoon of wool and fat, you've bought yourself a fragile reprieve. You smile wryly, knowing tomorrow you'll stink worse than ever, but at least you'll still be alive to complain about it. Because survival in a medieval tent wasn't about glory. It was about little tricks like this. Woolen socks and greasy fat, the unromantic tools that kept a soldier's blood flowing until dawn. The fat and wool keep your toes intact, but there's no escaping the truth. A tent, no matter how carefully stitched, or how many cloaks are draped across its seams, is still just canvas. It breathes with the wind, It leaks with the rain, and in the middle of winter it becomes little more than a sieve against the cold. And so, medieval soldiers had to get creative, not with fancy technology, but with the only things they had in abundance: weapons and gear. You may think of your shield as something to raise against arrows, but here in the tent it becomes something more humble and far less glorious. A wall. Picture the scene as dusk falls. The wind is already clawing at the flap, snowflakes slanting sideways. Inside, the tent sways like a sail, and the draughts sting like daggers against your cheek. You and your comrades look around for a solution. There are no extra boards, no carpenters to build barricades. What you do have are shields, broad, heavy, often wooden, their faces painted with symbols of lords or saints. And so, you drag them from the tent corner and lean them against the flap, stacking them at angles, wedging them tight until the open mouth of the tent shrinks into something closer to a fortress. At once, the draught eases. Not gone, but softened, tamed by the wall of oaken discs and kite-shaped boards. The warmth inside rises a fraction, enough to let you sigh in relief. Tonight, your shield will not save you from arrows, but from frost. This is no fantasy. Accounts from multiple campaigns mention soldiers using shields in every practical way imaginable. Tables, stools, sleds, even stretchers for the wounded. Turning them into windbreaks was simple common sense. You imagine the scene: half the painted devices of the army, the proud heraldry of noble houses now propped against the mud and snow to stop icy gusts from stealing your sleep. The irony isn't lost on you. These symbols of battle reduced to domestic tools, like so many dinner plates stacked against the cold. And here comes the quirky detail you won't forget. Sometimes soldiers stuffed cloaks, rags, or even handfuls of straw between shields to plug gaps. Think of it as the medieval version of caulking. Cracks leaked less, the draft slowed more, and suddenly the tent felt more like a cocoon. You, lying there now, grin at the absurdity of it. A knight's proud device, a golden lion rampant perhaps, wedged with straw like a barn wall. Somewhere, the nobleman who paid for the paintwork might be rolling in his grave, yet historians still debate how much difference these makeshift walls actually made. Were they clever improvisations that genuinely saved lives in bitter winters, or just minor comforts, symbolic gestures against forces too great to resist? Some insist the shields barely slowed the cold, while others argue that even small windbreaks could mean the difference between frostbite and another day of marching. The truth likely lies between not salvation, but mitigation. A sliver of warmth in a world of frost. You stretch your legs, boots propped against one of the shields, and feel the strange reassurance of it. This object that once caught arrows now catches the wind. You remember how many soldiers throughout history treated their gear not just as tools of war, but as parts of everyday survival. Helmets used as bowls, spears as tent poles, shields as tables, sledges or walls. To live on campaign was to turn everything into multi-purpose equipment, because luxury wasn't an option. The tent tonight feels almost civilized. The shields lean in a neat row, the flap secured tighter. A little fire outside glows faintly through cracks, and inside you and your comrades can stretch, without the gust cutting through every seam. For once, the air feels less like a knife, and more like a whisper. You allow yourself a brief joke. Who needs masons when we have carpenter's work strapped to our arms? The others chuckle, then roll over, already drifting. But it wasn't only shields. Spears and pikes sometimes formed frameworks for windbreaks, with cloaks hung across them like curtains. Saddles became barriers. Wagons rolled into circles created walls taller than men. The camp was a patchwork of improvisations, each soldier learning that every object had a double life, one for fighting, one for surviving. And you, still lying close to your comrades, know that tonight you owe your rest not to skill at arms, but to a painted plank of oak wedged against the flap. You may carry it proudly into battle tomorrow, but tonight it carries you through the cold. By dawn, frost will still rim the edges of the tent, your socks will still itch, and your straw mattress will still poke your ribs. But you'll rise less stiff, less bitter, because for once you outsmarted the wind with nothing more than the tools you already had, and that, in the brutal economy of medieval campaigning, was victory enough. The shields stand firm at the flap, The cloaks and straw muffle some of the draughts, and your belly still remembers the weight of ale and bread. You'd almost dare to call this a tolerable night, if not for one unshakable truth. Someone always had to stay awake. A medieval camp, however cramped or frozen, never truly slept. The darkness was full of dangers, ambushes, fires that gutted out, thieves both outside and inside the walls. And so the army divided its nights into shifts, appointing the watchman whose task it was to guard the living and the sleeping. Tonight, it's your turn, and that means you won't be curling up in the human furnace just yet. You sit hunched at the tent entrance, cloak pulled tight, spear across your knees. The cold gnaws at your ears first, then your toes, then your nose, like a wolf circling for the softest spot to bite. The fire outside has burned low, more ash than flame, and every gust of wind threatens to snuff it entirely. The stars above are sharp, cruel points of ice, and the moon stares down like a watchful eye, bright enough to reveal the mist rising from horses tied near the wagons. You shiver, not just from the cold, but from the weight of responsibility. History records it plainly. Guards were essential to survival. Roman legions perfected the system centuries earlier, and medieval armies continued the practice. A rota was drawn, men assigned to each watch of the night, expected to keep awake at all costs. To fail meant disaster. An enemy raid could sweep the camp, or the fire could die and leave comrades shivering helplessly. In fact, punishments for sleeping on watch were notoriously harsh. Chronicles speak of flogging, branding, or even execution, because one man's drowsiness could doom 1,000. You stifle a yawn, blinking at the shadows. The temptation is overwhelming. Behind you, your comrades breathe heavily in sleep, their warmth radiating, their snores almost a lullaby. Ahead, only the wind moves. Your eyes droop. You jolt awake, heart racing, clutching the spear tighter. You mutter to yourself, stay awake, rocking on the log where you perch. Now for the quirky detail that makes you grin in this bleakness. Some soldiers chewed bitter roots or even raw leather straps to keep from nodding off. Imagine gnawing on your bootlace just to trick your jaw into staying busy. Others sang softly under their breath, tuneless mutters that wandered into the night. Still others pinched themselves or slapped their own cheeks, a lonely battle to keep the lids from closing. It's absurd, but the absurdity is part of what makes it human. You sitting there, half frozen, half delirious, gnawing leather like a dog with a bone, all in the name of duty. Yet scholars still argue over how reliable these watches really were. Could exhausted soldiers truly maintain vigilance after days of marching and fighting? Some evidence suggests many did nod off, that raids and night attacks were often successful precisely because watchmen succumbed. Others argue that discipline and fear of punishment kept most alert, even if it meant staggering half-dead come morning. The truth likely shifted from camp to camp, night to night, sometimes vigilance, sometimes lapses that turned into tragedies. The burden of watch went beyond enemy eyes. You also had to tend the fire. Too much fuel, and sparks threatened to catch on tents. Too little, and the coals cooled, plunging everyone into misery. You poke the embers now, coaxing a little flame, shielding it from the wind with your palm. The glow flares, warms your face, then subsides again. You know you'll be repeating this dance until your shift ends, and there's the fear, always there. Every creak of canvas could be a thief slipping inside. Every snap of twigs might be raiders moving through the brush. Your imagination paints phantoms at the edge of the firelight, shadowy forms, gleaming eyes, whispers that vanish with the next gust. Fear and cold mingle until you can't tell which one makes your hands shake more. But then, a softer truth emerges. Being watchman was also an act of trust. Your comrades lay sprawled in the tent, utterly vulnerable. They believed you would keep them safe, keep the fire alive, keep your eyes open. In the silence, you feel that responsibility like a stone in your chest. You whisper a small joke to yourself. If they only knew I'm gnawing my bootlace to stay awake. But underneath the humour lies pride. You are the thin line between warmth and ruin. Hours crawl by. The stars wheel above. You stamp your feet, blow on your hands, chew again on the leather strap. Your breath feels like smoke in the frozen air. Finally, the faintest light touches the horizon, a grey smudge promising dawn. Relief floods you. You stumble back into the tent, shake the next unlucky soul awake, and hand over the spear. His groan says everything you feel. You collapse onto your straw, burrow into the huddle of bodies, and surrender at last to sleep. The cold still bites, the wind still howls, but for a few hours you're free of the watchman's burden. Someone else will chew leather now, someone else will tend the flame. And that, in the weary rhythm of medieval camp life, is the only way an army survived the endless freezing nights. You finally drift into sleep after your turn as watchman, straw scratching your cheek, grease still clinging to your toes, and the faint warmth of your comrades' bodies pressing in. The night should be dreamless, but instead it fills with a familiar unease. You wake with a jolt, not from the cold this time, but from the shadows inside your own head. Because in a medieval tent, fear was never only about frost or enemies with blades. Fear had other faces, spirits, demons, curses whispered in the dark. And when survival meant scraping by in the most miserable conditions, soldiers often reached beyond cloaks and fires. They reached for prayers, charms, and little rituals that promised safety when reason failed. You roll onto your back, staring up at the faint outline of the tent roof in the moonlight. The canvas ripples, and you tell yourself it's only the wind. But then you hear a groan, a muffled cry from one of your comrades. He thrashes in his sleep, muttering nonsense, and you remember the stories. Spirits that haunted camps, nightmares sent by witches, the devil slipping into dreams to test men's souls. And suddenly, the cold isn't your worst enemy. It's the unknown, the unseen, the feeling that death isn't just waiting outside with a sword, but crouched beside you on the straw. Here's the grounded truth. Medieval soldiers were deeply religious men, steeped in a world where prayer was as essential as bread. Before sleep, many would murmur the Pater Noster or the Ave Maria, crossing themselves, calling on saints for protection through the night. Priests sometimes walked the camp, blessing tents, sprinkling holy water, lifting voices in hymns that cut through the howl of the wind. To lie down without a prayer was to tempt fate, to leave yourself exposed not just to frostbite but to the devil's whisper. And then there were the charms. Soldiers carried little amulets, crosses carved from wood, relics bought at shrines, coins believed to bear protective power. One man tied a saint's medallion around his neck, another stitched a scrap of scripture into his cloak hem. Some even wore dried herbs, sage, rosemary, rue, believing their scent drove off evil. You imagine yourself fumbling now with a pouch at your neck, fingers stiff with cold, reassured by the simple weight of a token. Does it really protect you? Hard to say. But in a world without certainty, belief was warmth of its own. Now comes the quirky tidbit. Some soldiers muttered charms so odd they sound almost comic to modern ears. In German lands, one common rhyme invoked Christ's wounds as a shield against all witches and wild weather. In parts of France, soldiers whispered that saying the names of the three Magios, Caspar, Melchior, Balthazar, before sleep would stop nightmares. Imagine the chorus inside a tent, half a dozen men whispering strange syllables, some botching the Latin, others mumbling in dialect. It would sound more like drunken muttering than liturgy, but every man drifted off convinced he had built a barrier no frost could pierce. And yet historians still wrestle with how much of this was sincere faith, and how much was nervous habit. Were these rituals profound acts of devotion, or merely desperate routines born from exhaustion? Some argue soldiers' faith was absolute, that prayers were lifelines stronger than steel. Others suggest many went through motions without conviction, muttering charms just to ease their nerves. The record is tangled, testimony scattered. But what matters to you now, lying in the cold tent, is that everyone did something, because silence before sleep felt unbearable. The fears weren't baseless. Night brought dangers men couldn't explain. Sudden illness struck after an evening chill. A comrade who seemed fine at dusk was dead by dawn, his lips blue, his body stiff. Whispers spread. He was cursed, or a demon sat on his chest while he slept. The old terror of the night hag, a spirit believed to suffocate sleepers, was real in the minds of men. And so they prayed harder, clutched their charms tighter, hoping to keep invisible hands away. Even animals fed the superstition. Horses snorting in the dark, dogs growling at nothing, owls screeching above the camp. Every sound could be read as omen. You turn on your side now, listening to a horse stamping outside, and for a moment you too wonder if it's warning of raiders or something less earthly. You shake your head, muttering a quick charm under your breath, half mocking yourself, half comforted. But there's humour in it too, as there always is among soldiers. One man teases another, "Pray louder, or your saint won't hear you through that snoring." Another clutches a charm and swears it works, until he wakes up sneezing from the rosemary tucked in his hood. Laughter cuts the edge of fear, even as belief remains serious. You grin along, because what else can you do? Out here, courage is often half faith, half joke. Sleep comes again, uneasy but possible. You curl into the warmth, your fingers brushing the amulet at your chest. The wind still moans, the tent still sways, but your mind settles into the rhythm of whispered prayers and charms. And if nightmares come, at least you told yourself you had armour of a different kind. By dawn, the frost is still there, white crust on canvas, stiff ice in boots. But you rise, stretch, and glance at the charm still tied snug. Whether it worked or not doesn't matter. It gave you the courage to lie down, and in a world where courage often meant the difference between life and death, that was miracle enough. Morning has come again, pale and grey, your breath puffing like smoke in the frozen air. You step out of the tent, stretch your aching back, and notice the horses lined up beyond the camp. Their breath clouds in the chill, their hides dusted with frost, their tails flicking lazily despite the bitter wind. And suddenly you remember. The soldiers weren't the only ones shivering through the night. The animals, war horses, pack mules and nags, endured the same winter misery. And just as soldiers turn to one another for body heat, sometimes they turn to beasts. Yes, the same creatures that carried them into battle and hauled their burdens could also become bedfellows, sharing blankets, breath, and warmth in the icy dark. Imagine trudging across the camp after supper, cloak pulled tight, straw crunching under your boots. The tent is crowded, smoky and foul-smelling. Inside, there's hardly a patch of ground left for you to squeeze in, but the stables, or sometimes just a rope line strung to tether the beasts, beckon with another kind of promise. Horses stand broad and warm, their bodies radiating heat like slow-burning stoves. You run your hand across a flank, feel the living warmth beneath the shaggy winter coat and think, maybe tonight the smartest bed is beside them. And so, you pull your blanket, spread it near a horse's legs and curl up close. At first, the beast shift, snorts, uneasy with your nearness. But soon it settles, stamping once, then standing steady. You press your back to its flank, the heat seeping into you more surely than any smoky fire pit. The smell, sweat, manure, hay, fills your nose, but compared to the freezing wind, it's a perfume you can endure. Before long, your teeth stop chattering, your limbs stop aching, and you drift off with the rhythmic sound of the horse's breath above you. Here's the grounded fact. Medieval warhorses were wrapped in blankets themselves, especially in colder campaigns. Records show cloth coverings, sometimes wool, sometimes lined with fur, draped over prized destriers to protect their muscles from stiffening. Lesser horses might make do with rougher coverings, but the principle was the same. Warmth kept the animals alive and fit for marching. Soldiers, clever as always, realised that these blankets could help them too. Borrowed or shared, they became extra bedding or shields against the cold. And more than one man slipped under a horse blanket beside the beast itself, hoping to survive the frost. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some chroniclers joke that men became so attached to this practice that they gave nicknames to horses that saved their lives on winter nights. One tale describes a squire who swore eternal loyalty not to his knight, but to his knight's horse, because the animal's warmth had kept him from freezing to death in Burgundy. You can almost hear the laughter in camp, men teasing, "Better marry the horse then," as the squire rolled his eyes and muttered oaths of gratitude anyway. But historians still argue about how widespread this habit really was. Was sleeping beside horses a common practice for desperate infantry, or just a rare trick noted in anecdotes? Skeptics point out the dangers. Horses could kick in their sleep, roll suddenly, or crush a careless soldier. Others counter that necessity overcame risk, and men learned to settle themselves carefully, knowing the animals were more docile in winter exhaustion. The debate remains unsettled, but you, curled now against the imagined warmth of a shaggy flank, feel the logic in your bones. It wasn't just horses either. Dogs, too, served as bed warmers. Hunting hounds or guard dogs sometimes crept under cloaks with their masters, tails thumping, bodies curled tight. Even mules and donkeys offered heat when men dared approach. The medieval world was pragmatic. Beasts were companions in war, transport, food when desperate, and, when the frost bit deepest, fellow sleepers. You stir in the straw now, adjusting the rough blanket across your shoulders. The horse beside you flicks its ear, exhales a long cloud of steam. You feel the warmth cling to you, steady and dependable, and for once the cold doesn't seep so mercilessly into your bones. You murmur a thank you into the dark, a half joke, half prayer, and close your eyes. Of course, the arrangement wasn't perfect. Horses shifted, they smelled, they stomped, they occasionally urinated alarmingly close to your bedding. More than one soldier woke cursing, blanket splattered, dignity lost. But in the hierarchy of misery, embarrassment ranked lower than frostbite. You'd laugh, clean yourself off and do it again the next night, because better to stink than freeze. The bond between man and beast deepened in these nights. Soldiers learned to see their horses not just as tools of war, but as fellow sufferers. A knight who slept beside his destrier might rise with renewed affection, grooming the animal more carefully, feeding it scraps from his own rations. A foot soldier who borrowed warmth from a mule might pat its flank gratefully the next morning. These little gestures wove invisible threads of camaraderie, not just among men, but across species. By dawn, frost still coats the camp. The tent canvas is stiff, the ground is iron, but you wake less stiff than yesterday. You brush hay from your cloak, stretch your legs, and glance at the beast that shared its warmth. It stamps once, shakes its head, and you swear it nods knowingly, as if to say, "We both survived." And so you carry on, another night endured not just by fire, not just by wool, but by the living heat of creatures who marched beside you. In the brutal economy of survival, you realise sometimes your best comrade isn't the man snoring at your side, but the horse breathing gently above you. You stumble out from the warmth of horse breath, hay still clinging to your cloak, only to be greeted by the cruelest irony of all. Your armour has frozen solid. The dew and sweat of yesterday's march have turned to brittle frost. Your mail shirt is stiff as a plank, your helmet rim edged with white crystals, your leather straps crackling like glass when bent. Even your boots resist your tugging, laces frozen into unyielding knots. For a medieval soldier, dawn often meant not only shaking off the ache of straw and the stink of grease, but wrestling with iron and leather that had turned into ice-bound prisons overnight. Imagine crouching in your tent, fumbling with fingers still clumsy from sleep. You try to bend a strap, but it snaps like old wood. You curse under your breath, blow hot air onto the buckle, rub it with your hands. The metal is so cold it burns your skin, leaving red welts. You hesitate, then stick the piece under your armpit, shuddering as you try to warm it enough to flex. Around you, the camp is alive with the same misery. Men groaning, tugging at mail coifs frozen into balls, hammering stiff gauntlets on the ground to soften them, spitting on sword hilts to thaw the frost before gripping them. Here's the grounded fact. During campaigns in winter, frozen armour was a recorded problem. Chroniclers from the Baltic Crusades, where winters were especially brutal, wrote of soldiers struggling to arm themselves when the very gear meant to protect them had become stiff as boards. Rust was another curse. Dew froze, thawed, and froze again, leaving red streaks across every ring of mail. Men spent as much time oiling and scrubbing as they did fighting, lest their armour betray them with brittleness at the wrong moment. Now comes the quirky tidbit that's almost funny if you're not the one living it. Some soldiers are said to have urinated on frozen buckles to thaw them quickly. Yes, you wrinkle your nose, but imagine the scene. A man, desperate, fumbling with a strap that refuses to move, turning to the only warmth he can produce on command. Crude, but practical. Better embarrassment than fighting in half-frozen gear. The smell? Well, let's just say his comrades probably gave him wide berth for the day. But historians still argue whether soldiers commonly slept in their armour to avoid this very problem. Some evidence suggests yes. Men feared surprise night raids and kept mail shirts on even in slumber. Others argue that the discomfort of sleeping in chain or plate made this unrealistic, that most stripped it off to rest and suffered the frozen consequences come dawn. The debate goes on, and as you wrestle with a frozen strap now, you're not sure which misery you'd prefer. Sleepless nights in iron or mornings spent thawing it. You finally manage to tug your mail over your head. It slaps against your chest with icy weight, the rings biting into your neck. Your breath fogs against the helmet as you pull it down, instantly turning the inside damp, ready to freeze again within the hour. You clench your jaw, mutter another curse, and stomp your boots until they soften enough to march. All around, the camp resounds with the same ritual, the chorus of grunts, snaps, hisses of pain as frozen leather scrapes raw skin. Think of the absurdity. These were professional warriors, hardened men of steel and blood, yet reduced every morning to the role of laundresses, thawing and fussing with gear as if it were laundry on a line. A knight might carry a banner into battle, but at dawn he was just another miserable man blowing on buckles and rubbing frost off his visor. The contrast is almost comic, if you let yourself laugh through the pain. And then there's the danger. Armour stiffened by frost meant slower movement, weaker protection. Straps broke. Pieces fell loose in the heat of battle. Imagine charging into a skirmish only to feel your cuirass sag because the leather ties cracked at dawn. Soldiers learned quickly to carry spares, to bind things with rope or even strips of cloth when buckles failed. Survival demanded ingenuity, even in the smallest details. You stretch now, testing the weight of the frozen mail on your shoulders. It creaks like ice-laden branches, heavy and unforgiving. Your cloak still reeks faintly of goose grease, your socks itch, your stomach churns with last night's ale, and yet you're armoured again, ready for whatever march or fight comes next. It's miserable, yes, but it's routine. And that routine, ugly as it is, keeps the army moving. By mid-morning the frost will melt, the straps will loosen, and the armour will function as it should. But for those bitter dawn hours, you fight your gear as much as your enemy. And tomorrow, and the day after, the same battle will greet you again. Because in a medieval winter camp even steel could betray you. So you shoulder your spear, clank to your feet, and march out of camp with the others. The cold has already made the day a burden before it even begins. But you survived the night, and despite the frozen torment of dawn, you're alive enough to complain about it. And that, in the brutal arithmetic of campaign life, counts as victory. The armour creaks as you march, your breath forming clouds in the brittle dawn air. By midday the sun hangs pale above the field, doing little to warm anything, and even as the frost melts from your gauntlets, another battle is already brewing, not with lances or arrows, but with the oldest fuel of all, wood. Fire was the heartbeat of the camp, and without it soldiers froze, food stayed raw, and spirits withered. But firewood was never endless. Whole forests vanished under the axes of armies, hedgerows disappeared, villagers' fences got ripped down, and yet the demand never stopped. And when demand outstripped supply, men fought. Imagine trudging back into camp after a long patrol, only to find your tent mates glaring. The pile of wood you left yesterday is gone. You look around and see the next tent over with a suspiciously blazing fire, its men laughing over a pot. The accusation rises at once. Thieves! And suddenly swords are drawn not against the enemy, but against your own comrades in arms. In a world where warmth meant survival, wood was currency, and stealing it was almost as bad as stealing food. Here's the grounded fact. Chronicles from campaigns in France, Germany and the Baltic frequently mention shortages of fuel, especially in winter sieges. Armies stripped countryside bare, leaving villages treeless, and even then, fires sputtered. Commanders often had to organise wood-gathering patrols, sending soldiers into the surrounding land to chop, carry and drag logs back. Sometimes they returned with wagon loads, other times with nothing but frostbitten fingers and a few twigs, and always resentment grew when one unit had fuel while another shivered. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some camps men burned furniture looted from villages, not just stools and benches, but even wooden statues from churches. Imagine it. A saint's carved likeness feeding the flames, soldiers warming their hands over holy ash. Some laughed, others crossed themselves nervously, muttering that this was surely bad luck. But cold hunger has a way of silencing reverence. You picture yourself tossing a chair leg into the fire, the saint's carved foot glowing red, and thinking, "Forgive me, but at least I can feel my toes again." And historians still argue over how violent these firewood quarrels became. Were they minor scuffles, fists and curses exchanged in the frost? Or did some escalate into true bloodshed? Men skewered over a bundle of sticks. The record is patchy. One chronicler hints at serious clashes during a winter siege in Italy, while others gloss over it entirely, suggesting commanders suppressed the stories. The debate lingers, but anyone who has felt the bite of cold in their bones knows men will risk much, even kill, for the chance at fire. You walk the camp in your imagination now, and the signs of scarcity are everywhere. Smoke rises thin and uneven. One tent glows bright, its men grinning. Another sits dark, men inside wrapped in cloaks, muttering, glaring at the blaze across the path. The mood sours quickly. You hear curses in half a dozen dialects, threats spat over embers, and in the distance axes echo as woodcutters hack at whatever still stands. Thin saplings, fence posts, even wagon wheels. Sometimes the commander stepped in. Orders came, patrols to gather fuel, quotas to divide it fairly, punishments for theft. But discipline frayed in the cold. A knight might claim more than his share for his household, leaving foot soldiers to scrounge. A desperate man might sneak at night to steal from another tent. The next morning tempers flared, blows were exchanged, and order teetered on collapse. And then there were the long marches through barren land where no trees remained. Soldiers burned dung, straw, or even bones scavenged from fields. The fires sputtered, gave little warmth, but it was something. You imagine the camp reeking of scorched hair and dung smoke, men coughing but huddling anyway. Better stink than freeze. Always better stink. The struggle for wood shaped the very rhythm of camp life. Men rose early to gather, carried heavy loads back, argued over piles, and guarded their fuel as fiercely as their weapons. At night, the lucky ones sat around flames, singing or muttering prayers. The unlucky ones sat in shadows, glaring across at their luckier comrades, plotting how to steal what they lacked. It was a brutal economy, and you lived in it every day. Wood wasn't just fuel. It was warmth, food, safety, morale. Without it, even the strongest army crumbled into misery. With it, a man could endure another night. So you sit by your fire now, your shield propped behind you, your cloak wrapped close. You feed another log to the blaze, watching sparks jump, and you understand why men fought for this, why neighbours turned to enemies, why saints' statues vanished into smoke, why blood was sometimes spilled over sticks. Because in a frozen camp, survival burned with every log, and without it, you were nothing more than another stiff body in the snow. The fight over firewood leaves the camp sour. The ground around your tent is already stripped bare. The hedge is gone, the fence is dismantled, and still the cold creeps in. You know there will not be enough wood to last. Sooner or later the flames will gutter out, and when they do, you'll need another solution. That's when desperation pushes men into the ground itself. If the tent is no shield and the fire no certainty, then the earth becomes your refuge. Soldiers learn to carve shelters into snowbanks, scoop trenches into frozen soil, and build dugouts that, though crude, trapped heat more effectively than flapping canvas. Imagine trudging into camp after a day's march, snow knee-deep and wind gnawing at your cheeks. The tents go up, yes, but the canvas shudders, the stakes pull loose in the frozen soil, and everyone knows the wind will tear at them all night. Then one clever voice suggests, "Dig!" At first it sounds mad. Why dig when your body already aches? But soon men are hacking into the snow with axes, spades, even swords. A trench takes shape, low and narrow, then widened into a pit. Branches line the bottom, straw covers it, and cloaks drape over poles above. Crawl inside, and suddenly you feel it. Silence, stillness, a pocket of warmth shielded from the screaming wind. Here's the grounded fact. Chronicles of winter campaigns in Eastern Europe, particularly during the Northern Crusades, mention soldiers burrowing into snow for shelter. Archaeological finds at sites like Visby and Novgorod suggest dugouts, and improvised shelters were as much a part of campaign life as tents. Snow, ironically, could insulate better than canvas. Deep enough, and it held warmth, like a cocoon of ice that softened the bite of wind. Soldiers who despised their tents sometimes preferred these crude shelters, huddled underground like badgers. And now, the quirky tidbit that sticks in your imagination. In some camps, soldiers joked about becoming snow monks, referring to their dugouts as cloisters. They even gave them names: the chapel, the crypt, the oven. Imagine crawling into a pit half covered by straw and joking, "Ah, welcome to my chapel, mind the dripping ceiling." The humour barely masked the truth. Men were half buried, sleeping in tombs of ice, but laughing about it made the cold easier to bear. Historians still wrestle with how common these shelters were. Were they widespread strategies, or desperate improvisations only in the harshest regions? Some argue they were used regularly on long sieges in northern climates, while others insist most soldiers still clung to tents unless forced otherwise. The lack of consistent evidence keeps the debate alive, but as you huddle in your imagined dugout now, you can see why the idea endured. When wood was scarce and tents failed, the ground itself became a weapon against the cold. Inside the burrow, life was far from comfortable. The floor was damp, straw turned foul quickly, and melting snow dripped from the roof. Yet compared to the screaming wind above, it was heaven. You could breathe without your lungs aching. You could sleep without shivering every minute, and you could dream without the tent walls flapping like drums. For soldiers used to misery, that counted as luxury. Of course, dangers lurked. Fires lit inside dugouts risked suffocation. Snow ceilings sometimes collapsed, burying men alive. Dig too deep, and you found groundwater that froze into a slick, sucking mud. But those risks seemed minor compared to frostbite and death. The soldier's choice was never between comfort and discomfort. It was between misery and survival. Picture the camp now, tents scattered across the field, but between them mounds of snow with little holes cut in, like a strange village of burrows. Smoke curls faintly from some, laughter muffled beneath drifts. To an outsider it might look like the earth itself has swallowed the army. To you it feels like crawling into the grave each night, but one that spits you back out at dawn. And in the dugout, camaraderie deepened. Men squeezed tighter, shared body heat more effectively, passed flasks of ale hand to hand, and told stories that echoed off icy walls. You hear one man boast of a saint's protection, another joke about marrying the snow if it kept him warm, another whisper of ghosts outside. The closeness bred both irritation and intimacy, but above all it kept you alive. By morning you claw your way out, blinking against the pale sun covered in frost and straw. Your cloak stinks, your boots are stiff, but you survived another night in your snow crypt. You glance back at the hole, mutter half a laugh, half a curse, and know you'll crawl into it again tonight if you must. Because when tents failed and firewood vanished, snow and soil became your home. And though it felt like bedding down in a tomb, the soldier's grim truth was simple. Better a living grave in winter than a real one by dawn. You crawl out of your snow burrow, straw clinging to your cloak, your breath hanging like mist in the air. The camp spreads before you. Rows of sagging canvas, dugouts in the drifts, horses steaming as they stamp their hooves, and then your eyes wander further, to the far end of the field, where the largest tents stand like palaces amid hovels. These belong to the commanders, the nobles, knights banneret, dukes, sometimes even kings, and while you spent the night chewing on frost, they slept wrapped in rugs, lulled by braziers, surrounded by stolen comforts that make you grind your teeth with envy. Picture one of those tents, towering, striped in colours, decorated with pennants that flutter even in the weak winter breeze. The canvas is thicker, sometimes doubled, and the seams are sewn more tightly. Inside, carpets cover the frozen ground, furs line the walls, and tapestries hang like insulation. A brazier glows in the centre, coals hissing as servants tend it carefully, keeping the noble warm without filling the air with choking smoke. Atop cushions and feather-stuffed mattresses, the commander snores softly, his boots drying by the fire, his cloak perfumed rather than greasy. Compared to your straw burrow, it may as well be paradise. Here's the grounded fact. Archaeological digs and manuscript illustrations confirm that high-ranking officers travelled with far better tents and furnishings. Royal accounts list entire wagon loads of bedding, rugs and braziers brought on Copain. Some noble tents resembled portable houses, with separate chambers for sleeping, eating and receiving guests. The contrast between such luxury and the foot soldier's misery was stark, and often resented. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some cases nobles even brought folding beds. Yes, folding beds made of wood and rope, designed to collapse for travel. Chroniclers describe kings and dukes lounging on these contraptions while their men froze. Imagine the sight. A lord reclining in relative comfort, sipping spiced wine, while outside his soldiers gnawed on hard bread with frozen fingers. The unfairness burned hotter than any fire. Historians still debate how much these luxuries actually helped. Did thick rugs and braziers truly make a tent warm in sub-zero weather? Or were commanders still shivering, just less miserably than their men? Some argue that even nobles could not escape frostbite when campaigns dragged on. Others point to records of elaborate comforts, furs, feather beds, heated stones wrapped in cloth, as proof that their nights were far easier. The evidence is mixed, and perhaps the truth lies in between. Commanders endured hardship, but with layers of privilege buffering the worst of it. You imagine stepping into such a tent now. The air is warmer, smelling faintly of pine resin from the brazier. The floor is soft beneath your boots, cushioned by layered carpets. A servant pours wine into a cup, and your commander, wrapped in a fur mantle, nods to you lazily. You grit your teeth, because outside your comrades gnaw onions for heat while this man eats roasted meat. Yet you also understand. In the brutal hierarchy of medieval war, luxury was not shared. Status bought survival. Still, envy had its limits. Soldiers grumbled, yes, but they also clung to the hope that their commander's comfort meant better leadership. If he was rested and healthy, perhaps the campaign would be shorter, perhaps battles would be won more swiftly, perhaps winter nights would end sooner. The logic was cold comfort, but in an army hope mattered almost as much as firewood. Of course, theft was always a temptation. Stories abound of servants sneaking from noble tents, pilfering scraps of food, even dragging off old rugs to sell warmth in smaller shelters. And sometimes nobles themselves rewarded loyal men by lending comforts, a fur thrown across a sick soldier, a cup of wine shared with a favoured squire. These moments softened the edge of resentment, though never erased it entirely. Humour, as always, eased the bitterness. Soldiers joked that nobles' tents were so warm they bred fleas too lazy to bite, or that the commanders' braziers were less for heat than for roasting the endless geese nobles insisted on eating. You chuckle now at the thought, picturing a brazier glowing with half-warmed boots on one side and a fat goose dripping grease on the other. But resentment simmered too. You lie back on your straw, listening to laughter drifting from the noble tents, and mutter under your breath. The gap between your snow burrow and their silk-lined pavilion is wide, and you know it. Survival here is a hierarchy, and the higher you stand, the warmer you sleep. By dawn, when you shuffle stiffly to muster, you glance again at the grand tents. The commanders emerge cloaked in fur, yawning lazily, their boots dry, their faces fresh. You, by contrast, stink of grease, your cloak stiff with frost. Yet you march behind them anyway, because this is the order of things. And perhaps tonight, if luck is kind, you'll scavenge a scrap from their fire, a threadbare rug discarded by a careless servant. In the end, the luxury of commanders' tents was a cruel reminder. Survival was never equal. Comfort was hoarded at the top, while the rest endured. And though you mutter curses, you also know, if you lived to rise in rank, you'd want the same furs, the same rugs, the same brazier glowing in the night. Because when the world freezes, no one chooses misery if they can afford warmth. The commanders' pavilions glitter with warmth and rugs, but for you and the rest of the rank and file, there's no time to linger in envy. The trumpet sounds, the banners lift, and the entire camp heaves itself to its feet. Another march begins. You pack your straw, tug on your stiff boots, shoulder your spear, and set off down the frozen road. The day stretches ahead, mile after mile of trudging across icy ruts, through sleet and mud, under skies the colour of lead, and the cold that haunted you in the tent now finds new ways to torment you, creeping into your bones as you walk, numbing your limbs until you stumble half dead into the next camp. Picture yourself on that march. At first, the body moves with rhythm, boots thud against frozen earth, the jingle of mail rings with every step, the hiss of breath steams into the air. But as hours drag by, the fatigue builds. Your shoulders sag under the weight of gear, a shield slung at your back, a pike clattering on your shoulder, a pack stuffed with dried bread and maybe a strip of salt pork. Each pound feels like 10 by the third hour. Your fingers ache from gripping leather straps. Your toes go first, turning numb, as if they've vanished inside your boots. You stamp them harder, hoping to coax blood back, but the relief never lasts. Here's the grounded fact. Records from campaigns in winter describe men collapsing from exhaustion after days of marching in snow, Chroniclers of the 100 Years' War noted soldiers arriving at sieges so drained they dropped where they stood, too numb to pitch tents. Frostbite and hypothermia claimed more men on these marches than battle sometimes did. Commanders knew it, and yet the march had to continue. Supplies had to move, positions had to be reached. Wars did not pause for weather. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some soldiers stuffed snow or ice into their mouths while marching, not just to quench thirst but to stay awake. It sounds absurd, sucking cold to fight the cold, but it shocked their bodies enough to keep them moving. Others carried little balls of bread or nuts in their pouches, chewing constantly as if the rhythm itself kept fatigue away. You picture yourself with snow crunching between your teeth, muttering that you'd rather have wine, but trudging on anyway because anything was better than nothing. Yet historians still argue over how disciplined these marches really were. Did armies truly maintain order, lines trudging neatly for miles, or did they straggle in clumps, men dropping behind, collapsing in ditches? Some evidence points to remarkable endurance, while other accounts paint chaos. Men scattering, stealing food from villages, dragging themselves at their own pace until officers whipped them back into line. The reality likely shifted with every campaign, sometimes ordered, sometimes a stumbling mess of half-frozen bodies. The worst part wasn't always the cold itself, but what it did to the mind. Fatigue gnawed at thoughts until even fear dulled. You marched in a trance, eyes half closed, feet moving by habit alone. Some soldiers fell asleep while walking, jolting awake only when they stumbled against a comrade. The world narrowed to the rhythm of boots, the rasp of breath, the endless whiteness of snow or greyness of mud. You felt exhaustion before, but this is different. It eats the will as much as the body. And then comes evening. You stumble into the next camp, body screaming for rest. The tent goes up sluggishly, poles wobbling, ropes knotted clumsily. You barely notice. You drop your shield, sink into the straw, and the moment your body touches the ground, sleep drags you down. There is no tossing, no turning, no fretting over drafts. You collapse so deeply that even the cold can't keep you awake. There's dark humour here too. Men joked that fatigue was the best blanket. Too tired to shiver, they'd say, laughing weakly as they dropped into unconsciousness. And in a way it was true. Exhaustion dulled the edge of misery. The cold was still there, gnawing, but the body simply shut down, demanding rest no matter the conditions. You could sleep in mud, in snow, even standing against a pole, so long as fatigue held you tight. But the dangers of such collapse were real. Men who fell too deeply asleep sometimes never woke, especially if snow drifted over them or if their comrades forgot to shake them. Frostbite crept silently into fingers and toes. Pneumonia bloomed in lungs weakened by marching breath. A soldier could die not from battle, not from wounds, but simply from lying too still after a day's march. You shiver at the thought, even as you imagine yourself rolling into straw, boots still on, cloak still fastened, not caring whether you smell of grease and smoke. Morning comes too quickly. A trumpet sounds again, dragging you from dreamless blackness. Your body aches, your limbs are stiff, and your gear feels heavier than ever. You mutter curses, push yourself upright and trudge out once more. It is the cycle of campaign life. March until numb, collapse without shivering, wake stiff, march again. You understand now why survival depended not just on warmth, but on endurance. The strongest armies were not always those with the best weapons, but those whose men could march day after day, half frozen, half starved, yet still rise and keep moving. Fatigue was a constant enemy, fought with jokes, with bread, with stubbornness, with sheer willpower. And though the noble tents glittered with rugs and braziers, even their occupants felt the drag of numb limbs when dawn called for another march. So you pull your cloak tighter, shift your spear across your back, and take the first step onto another frozen road. Behind you, the camp sinks into silence. Ahead, more miles of misery. But you keep moving, because stopping means death, and survival is found only in the stubborn rhythm of boots striking frozen earth. You march on through numb limbs and aching shoulders, each step a war of its own. The frost cuts, the wind howls, yet still you and your comrades push forward, because survival leaves no other option. And as the camp rises again in the evening gloom, fires sputtering, tents creaking, men collapsing onto straw, you hear the stories begin. Around every brazier, whispered through chattering teeth, legends grow, Tales of soldiers who endured impossible winters, of knights who laughed at frost, of comrades who survived weeks with nothing but grit and prayer. These legends weren't just idle talk, they were blankets of their own, woven from memory and myth to keep men's spirits alive when the cold threatened to break them. Imagine huddling by a small blaze, a half-frozen mug of ale in your hands. The smoke stings your eyes. Your cloak reeks of grease. But the words drifting from your neighbour's lips pull you out of misery for a moment. He tells of a crusader who crossed mountain passes barefoot, his toes black with frost, yet still marched into battle and swung his sword as if nothing ailed him. Another man swears he heard of a German knight who slept in snow pits for 40 nights without a cloak, and rose each morning unscathed. The stories grow with each telling, embroidered with fresh detail until they glow brighter than the coals. Here's the grounded fact. Medieval chronicles are full of accounts of soldiers enduring terrible winters. During the famous retreat of the Teutonic Knights after the Battle of Lake Peipus, entire companies supposedly marched across frozen rivers in mail, barely pausing to rest. During the siege of Antioch, men supposedly survived on scraps of frozen horseflesh, sleeping in icy ditches. Whether embellished or not, these stories became touchstones of endurance, reminders that cold alone could not stop men bound by faith or duty. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some soldiers believed that rubbing themselves with snow actually hardened their bodies, making them more resistant to the cold. One account from a Baltic campaign mentions men laughing as they stripped to the waist and rolled in drifts, daring one another to endure the sting. Absurd? Yes. Dangerous? Absolutely. But in their minds it proved toughness, a badge of honour against the cold. You chuckle now at the thought, picturing a half-drunk band of soldiers wrestling in the snow, boasting that they would live longer than anyone wrapped in blankets. But historians still argue about how much of these legendary tales were truth and how much exaggeration. Did men truly march barefoot in snow for days? Or was that a storyteller's flourish? Did knights actually shrug off frostbite? Or did chroniclers shape their struggles into miracles of endurance to inspire readers? The debate continues, because sources are often contradictory, heroic in one chronicle, pitiful in another, and as you listen to the stories tonight, you sense the blur between fact and myth doesn't matter. What matters is the warmth these tales give to weary men's hearts. You listen to one particularly grim story now. A comrade swears he knew a man who lost 3 fingers to frostbite, yet kept fighting, his sword strapped to his maimed hand. The tent fills with gasps and murmurs. Someone else scoffs, saying no one could wield a sword like that. Another insists it was true that the man became famous. The argument sparks laughter, even mock bickering, and for a moment the cold recedes beneath the fire of debate. Legends feed hope as much as food feeds the belly, and there were saint stories too. Tales of holy men who endured freezing nights wrapped in nothing but faith. Soldiers repeated them with reverence, believing that endurance was not just possible but blessed. Some swore that calling on Saint Martin, patron of soldiers, gave them warmth in their sleep. Others prayed to Saint George, imagining his dragon-fighting fire warming their limbs. Faith and folklore blurred into survival strategy, each saint's legend an ember against despair. You roll onto your straw later, cloak wrapped tight, and whisper one of those tales to yourself. Not because you know it's true, but because you need to believe in something more than grease, straw, and smoke. You imagine the German knight laughing in the snow, the crusader striding barefoot across frozen ground, the comrade who fought with 3 fingers gone. You cling to their endurance as if it might spill into your own body, warming you from the inside out. There's humour too, of course. Men teased one another with outlandish boasts. I once slept naked in a snowdrift and woke warmer than I went in. Or, my mother wrapped me in ice as a baby to toughen me. The camp roared with laughter at such nonsense, but beneath it all was a serious edge. Laughter kept despair from swallowing them, and tall tales made their suffering feel smaller. By dawn, the stories linger. The legends, the boasts, the whispered prayers, they cling to you like an extra cloak. The frost still stings, the wind still cuts, but you rise believing you carry a spark from all those who came before. Perhaps you cannot laugh at frost like the knights of legend, but you can march another day, and in that simple endurance, you become part of the story yourself. The stories of impossible endurance linger in your ears long after the laughter fades, but when the fire gutters low and the cold creeps back in, you realise that you've come to the hardest trial of all, the long, endless night. It is the final test every soldier faces, a test not of strength on the battlefield but of will in the hours before dawn. The dark seems eternal, the frost relentless, and you discover that survival is not about winning, but about enduring one more hour, one more breath, one more heartbeat. You lie awake, shifting on straw that crunches with frost, listening to the canvas sigh with every gust. The shields braced against the flap tremble but hold. Your neighbour shifts, his elbow digging into your side, his breath hot against your cheek. The horse outside stamps, shaking ice from its mane. The fire has burned to embers, the glow faint, and no one wants to rise to feed it. The camp is a kingdom of stillness broken only by coughs, snores, and the occasional muttered prayer. Here's the grounded fact. Countless medieval campaigns recorded the toll of these nights. Chroniclers of the Burgundian Wars, the Crusades, and the endless winter sieges wrote of men who did not wake, claimed silently by cold that seeped too deep. Armies sometimes lost more to frost than to swords, their numbers dwindling without a single battle fought. The night was the enemy, and every soldier knew it. And here's the quirky tidbit that softens the grimness. Some soldiers swore that singing in their sleep kept them warm. Yes, singing. Accounts hint at men half-conscious, murmuring hymns or folk tunes as they drifted, as if rhythm itself could ward off frost. Others teased them in the morning, saying they sounded like dying geese, but if they woke alive, who cared how foolish they'd looked? Still, historians debate whether soldiers truly endured these nights through sheer stubbornness, or whether commanders took more practical measures, like rotating men between warmer and colder spots in the tent, or pairing the weakest with the strongest. The evidence is scarce, leaving scholars to puzzle. Was survival mostly strategy, or mostly luck? The truth likely lay in a cruel blend of both. You feel it now, the way time stretches. Minutes drag like hours, hours like days. You curl tighter, pull your cloak across your face and count breaths. Your toes tingle, then go numb. Your fingers ache, then stiffen. You wonder if you'll be the one who doesn't stir at dawn, if tonight the cold will finally claim you. You whisper a joke to yourself, if I freeze, at least I won't have to march tomorrow. But the humour only half lifts the dread. The endless night tests more than your body. It tests your faith, your resolve, your bonds with the men beside you. When a comrade stirs, shifting his cloak over your shoulder, you feel a flicker of gratitude strong enough to banish despair. When someone mutters a charm or a prayer, you repeat it softly, not because you believe it will keep frost away, but because the sound keeps silence from crushing you. The night feels longer than any battle. A fight ends with victory or death, but this stretches on, neither ending nor easing, only demanding endurance. You remind yourself of every trick you've learned. Wool socks, greasy fat, straw beds, shield walls, snow burrows, horse breath, even onions in your belly. And still, the cold comes. Still, you fight the enemy you cannot see. Dawn at last begins to seep in, pale grey light filtering through the canvas. You've survived. You stretch, bones aching, joints stiff, but your lungs draw breath, your eyes open. Around you, some men rise groaning, others coughing, one or two lying too still. The camp stirs, shaking frost from cloaks, coaxing embers into flames, preparing for another day. You stand, shoulders heavy, but a smile tugging your lips. You pass the test. And that is the truth of it. In the frozen nights of medieval campaigns, survival was not one great act of courage, but 1,000 small ones, sharing warmth, saying prayers, chewing leather, stuffing straw, smearing grease, singing in your sleep. Each trick, each laugh, each whispered legend was another thread in the fragile tapestry of life. Soldiers endured not because they were unbreakable, but because they clung together against the endless dark. And now, as we leave the frozen tents behind, let's slow the pace. Imagine the camp quiet at last, smoke curling gently into the soft dawn sky. The horses stand still, the soldiers stir slowly, their movements sluggish but alive. The bitter night has passed, and the frost on the canvas glimmers harmlessly in the first touch of sunlight. You too feel the relief, the knowledge that you endured what felt endless, and that morning always comes, no matter how deep the dark. The voices of the camp are softer now. No quarrels over firewood, no curses at frozen armour, no nervous laughter over strange charms. Just the muted shuffle of boots on frost, the quiet murmur of men greeting another day, the faint crackle of a newly kindled fire. The danger isn't gone. War still waits, hunger still gnaws, and the cold will return with dusk, but for now there is calm. And in that calm you find a strange peace. Let your mind drift with the smoke rising into the pale sky. The noise of the world falls away, leaving only the slow, steady rhythm of breath. The endless night is behind you, and the morning stretches out before you, soft and forgiving. Rest now, in the knowledge that even in the harshest times people found ways to endure. They huddled together, whispered prayers, shared warmth, and told stories, just as we've done tonight. The cold may bite, the nights may stretch, but dawn always follows, gentle and certain. So close your eyes, loosen your shoulders, and let the last of the frost melt from your thoughts. Sleep deeply, dream softly, and carry with you the quiet strength of those who endured before you.